morning to everyone and welcome virtually to the SOAS Center of Buddhist Studies. My name is Stefania Travagnin. I'm reader in Chinese Buddhism and chair of the Center of Buddhist Studies here at SOAS. We are extremely delighted to have Professor Stephanie Balkwill with us tonight. She's going to be the speaker for the third event of the series of the Robert Hall Foundation lecture series in Chinese Buddhism that we have had at SOAS for quite a few years already. And also this is going to be the last official event, not just in the series of the Robert Hall Foundation series, but also our academic year. We have to move this event online for unforeseen circumstances, but this doesn't mean that we don't want to have Stephanie here with us. So we are planning to do something together in person as soon as possible, so we can also enjoy more of conversations with her about her research topic. Being a webinar and online, for those of you who are less familiar with that, we are going to have the talk of Stephanie, and then we're going to be time, half an hour more or less, for a Q&A. If you have any questions for Stephanie, you could type it on the Q&A tab, which is on the bottom of the Zoom screen. If you don't find it, there is also a chat. You can type in both of them, and then I will read the question. I believe I can also allow you to speak, so to ask a question in person, if that's more lively and less virtual, which is always nice. The Robert Hall Foundation has been sponsoring events at SOAS. We are extremely grateful for the help and the support that allow us to bring scholars here, not just virtually, but here in London, and to have both a public talk and a seminar with postgraduate students and whoever is interested in the topic of the seminar. So usually it's two events. We have two events in one block, and for this, in this case, since it's an online event, we're just going to have the public talk. The series in Chinese Buddhism has been organized as free lectures, free events, free double events during the academic year, looking at different topics. We started with something modern and contemporary with Ron Tao Lai from McGill University. We talk about her new research on the Tiantai lineage, the different way of identification of lineage and identification of monastics today. Then just a couple of weeks ago, we have Yu Ming Kim here at SOAS to talk about Liao Buddhism, so something more historical, also bringing art history, ritual studies, and history of China, early history of China together. Today, we go to something historical and textual. So that should be the topic of the third block of the series. And we have chosen something that is about gender studies as well, which fit very well with another event where we have part of a Buddhist forum sponsored by the Cancer Foundation, but also was looking at women in Buddhism, Asian religions, more in general, women in India, I would say. In this case, is women in China, in the Buddhist China / Chinese Buddhism. Before talking a little bit about the talk, I'm going to say something about our speaker, even if I'm pretty sure everyone knows very well who Stephanie is. Stephanie is Associate Professor of Chinese Buddhism at the University of California, Los Angeles, and where she's also Director of the Center of Buddhist Studies. She has had an interest in women in Chinese Buddhism, of public life, political life, intellectual life, but what is also of Buddhist women in pre-modern China, so 4th to 6th century. What is also interesting, and especially to me, is the kind of sources that Stephanie is using for her work, as sources that she defined as peripheral to historiography, but would say very often are also peripheral to the study of Buddhism in general. So choosing women that are out there, and there are more, is an emerging field right now for the study of women in Chinese religions or Chinese Buddhism. between the topic and also the sources is really, with her scholarship, is really giving light and life to important page in the history of Chinese Buddhism. Her monograph just came out a few months ago with University of California Press. The title is The Women Who Ruled China, Buddhism, Multiculturalism, and Governance in the 6th Century. She has also co-edited a volume with James Ben of this titled Buddhist Statecraft in East Asia. And she has a number of articles and publications in important journals like the Journal of Chinese Buddhist Studies, Nanyu, History of Religions, Religion Compass, and Journal of Chinese Religion. The talk of today is something that comes from the latest monograph of Stephanie. So this is a talk that is a talk and slash a book launch, if you may. So I know that many people were looking forward to meet Stephanie here in London, and also people who have already read your book. So I expect that in the Q&A, there may be questions about the book and not just about your talk, but I think that's okay for you. Without any further ado, I will just give the floor, the mic, to Stephanie. And the title, as you can see from the first slide, is The Women Before the Woman, Building a Backstory for the Rise and Rule of Empress Wu. Stephanie, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Just let me give a few thanks first to Professor Chevalier for welcoming me and inviting me to participate in this series, a series of wonderful guest speakers that I've sort of watched from afar, good dear colleagues of mine. So I'm really proud and happy to be here. And I'm sorry I couldn't be here in person, but as you say, we'll make that happen soon. And also gratitude to the SOAS Center for Buddhist Studies and to the Robert Ho Foundation for making so much of the work that we do in Buddhist Studies possible. And thank you for that introduction. Actually, your introduction to my talk was kind of perfect, because during the talk today, I do want to talk a little bit about the sources that I'm using, the methodological commitments I have as a scholar of Buddhist studies and a historian of China, but also about the research itself and some of the things that I've sort of discovered that I talk about in the book. So I'm going to talk out of the book in some parts, but also try to talk around the book. And I'm happy to field questions about any parts of the book. I'm happy to field questions about any of my other scholarship as well, if you have questions that you'd like to ask me in this forum today. So yeah, I titled the talk, The Women Behind the Woman. And what I'm trying to do, obviously, is to highlight maybe the most famous woman who ever came out of Chinese history, who we often call Empress Wu, who I'll talk about in a couple of slides. But what I want to do is sort of show that the story that we've told of that woman, we often tell of her as a kind of one-woman show who sort of rose out of the Tang dynasty of her own sort of unique power, and that's true. But what I want to do is actually contextualize her life in the lives of women that came before her, and talk about the fact that actually we have a large collection of women in early medieval China who were experimenting with political rule and sort of public patronage of Buddhism, and that Empress Wu is the most successful of these women. But if we tell the full story, I think, of the women, then we get a much more accurate and interesting historical portrait of what was actually happening on the ground, as far as we can tell, in the 5th and 6th centuries, which is where we're going to go for this talk. So let me start with this most famous woman who ruled China. So if you Google anything about women in Chinese history, you will be given a portrait of Wu Zetian, or Empress Wu as we often call her, for good reason, of course. She was a tremendously powerful politician. She was, by all accounts, sort of fearless in her ability to take power as a female leader. She is, the one and only woman who ruled China with the gendered male title of emperor, or Di, and that's why people often say that she's the only woman that ruled China. There are many other women who have held political power and political influence and even direct rule in the history of Chinese empires and polities, but none that did what she did, which is to rule with that gendered male title and to hold her rule for a long time. Other women have faced shorter reigns and potentially more challenges. So she was very successful in what she did. So let's I want to jump into a few things just for the first 5 minutes of the talk. We'll talk about her particularly, and then we're going to jump backwards in time and see what some of the other things that we can bring to this story will tell us. So these are some of the basic things that I'm going to talk about in my talk today that we know are associated with Empress Wu and her rise and rule in the Tang Dynasty and eventual establishment of her own dynasty or empire, the Zhou. And we call her Empress Wu as a shorthand. Of course, she had more accurate titles at the different stages in her career in which she held different political portfolios. So the two names that I will use interchangeably, we can call her Empress Wu Zetian when she is empress to Gaozong, and she's one of the rulers who rules the Tang alongside him, and I'll talk about that in a second. And we can also call her Emperor Wu Zhao. So this is the title that she takes when she establishes her own polity and rules with that gendered male title of Di. So I think we should differentiate sometimes how it is that we're calling her and recognize that actually her political portfolio was wide and that she had a number of different titles. So I'm going to go over a very few things here that we know for certain that are strongly associated with her political rise and some of the strategies that she used to hold political power in the time that she did. And then we're going to back up and we'll see how these things have a life before her in time. So many people who work on the Tang or who read Tang Dynasty sources point out that while she was empress, there was this kind of dynamic where she wasn't sort of a quiet empress. She was an empress who wanted to exert power. And the reign of her and Gaozong is often called the reign of the two sages. So instead of just an empress kind of behaving quietly behind the scenes, she was somebody who had voice and who had influence. And we see their reign emblematized in a number of sources as the reign of the two sages. And I just put that there because I want you to keep that word or that title, two sages, in mind, because it's something we're going to see again, even though it's long been associated with the Tang Dynasty and with Wu Zetian at that time. So what else we're going to talk about? We know that in the various stages of her career, she was an active and known Buddhist patron, particularly as Emperor Wu Zhao. She put a lot of money and a lot of resources into building Buddhist structures, monasteries, pagodas, cave temples. We're going to look later on in the talk at some of the cave temples in Longmen, which are Northern Wei caves, which we'll talk about, but she also patronized those caves and built sort of massive Buddhist structures in those caves. Some people argue that one of the Buddhas that she patronized actually holds her face, like it looks like her, and we'll see that, we'll see some of that in the Northern Wei as well. We know that her interest in Buddhism also expanded to text. In particular, a text called the Great Cloud Sutra, which is a text that bears a prophecy. And the prophecy tells us that the future Buddha Maitreya will be born potentially in a female body at some point. And the future Buddha Maitreya is often associated with political reestablishment or rebellion in this period. So we get this strong prophecy in this text that is applied to her when she takes power as Emperor Wu Zhao. It's said that she is the fulfillment of prophecy there. So we've got her interest in Buddhist text, in reading Buddhist text for its contents, and then giving a political interpretation of it. We know that she was not the only woman in her court. We know that there were other women who worked around her and with her and held a number of different titles. We know this from various types of historical sources, but most, I guess the best sources are to look at tomb inscriptions, and we've found tomb inscriptions dated of her sort of highest prime minister. So many people call her prime minister, a female prime minister. So we know that she had a very stratified court of women. And the last thing that we're going to talk about with respect to her, because it will have importance for what we'll talk about later, is that while she was in power, she acknowledged her own ethnic diversity. So she put posthumous honors on her family line that are said to descend from a group of people that came from Inner Asia. And we're going to talk about those people a lot because those are the people who founded the Northern Wei Empire that we'll focus on. So she sort of acknowledged that she had the ability to pull from two different cultural systems, one that we associate with Han Chinese civilization and the Han Empire, and the one that we associate with non-Han persons that came from Inner Asia. So what I want to just kind of briefly encapsulate here is we're going to play on themes of female members at court, women holding political power. We're going to play with the ideas of Buddhist patronage, of both textual sources and our historical sources, and we're going to talk about female bureaucracy and ethnic diversity. And all of those are important to the story of the rise of Wu Zetian to become Emperor Wu Zhao. And all of those are important about 200 years earlier, when we can talk about a different court of women, the court of the Northern Wei. All right. So as I point out in my book, and I just show you the cover of my book here because it's maybe my favorite part of the book. I really love how the cover turned out. I'll also say that the book is completely open access online, so you can read it, you can download it. You do not need to buy it. Please don't buy it unless you really, really like it, but just please go read it online. It's there for you. So we're going to look at basically chapter 4 of my book. We're going to try to think about these women that came before this most famous woman through chapter 4 that talks about a kind of crisis of succession that we're going to dive into. Again, in Q&A, I'm happy to talk about any of the sections of the book. There are many women's lives and stories in that book that are not going to make it into this talk today, but I'm happy to field questions about anything if you've read the book and are interested in larger conversations. So we're going to back up about 200 to 150 years before the reign of Emperor Wu Zhao. And we're going to talk about a court that's called the Northern Wei. It was an empire that an Inter-Asian empire in East Asia called the Northern Wei that famously had a lot of women at their court. And that's what drew me to thinking about their court historically and what women were doing there. So let's jump in. I'm going to keep this talk as accessible as possible for people in the room who are not specialists in Chinese history. I recognize that there are people in the Zoom room who are specialists of Chinese history, and we can go deeper into the weeds in Q&A. But for now, I want to go for some very broad strokes and think about this period of time that I'm talking about. So we're going to talk mostly about the 5th and 6th centuries of the Common Era for the next half an hour or so. This period of time in Chinese historiography is often referred to as the medieval period or the early medieval period because it's a China between empires. So we've got a collapse of central governing systems for 400 years or so, and that's the period of time that I'm quite interested in. It is characterized often as a kind of dark time of competing political entities, and that is true. There's chaos and death and political violence all over the place in this period. But we can also think about this period in a different way, and that's how I prefer to think about it. We can think of it as a time of intense ethnic, cultural, linguistic, and religious diversity, diversity in cultural regimes, gender regimes. There's a whole bunch of stuff happening on the ground in China in this period that is formative for later China, and in fact, the rest of East Asia. And that's where I'm kind of putting my talk today, is in this chaotic time that creates change and diversity. And we're just going to dive right into here in a few different ways. Okay, forgive me for putting up a map of the Chinese dynasties. This is a very common map that you might see online. I don't mean to overwhelm anybody or be too simple for anybody, but I wanted to just point out what we're talking about here. So we've got this rough progression of the map of Chinese dynasties from the perspective of mainstream Chinese historiography, which we'll talk about further. What I want to focus on is this line here, and I just want to show you where we are, position ourselves in space and time before we dive deeper. So I'm going to talk in this talk about basically 3 different periods in some way. So I'll talk about the Han Empire. I'm sure you all have heard of the Han Empire. It's a big, powerful empire that spans about 200 years either side of the turn of the Common Era. So it's a long, stable empire. Many of the things that we associate with Chinese culture and history come out of the Han Empire. So forms of statecraft, philosophy, literature, social organization are all rooted in this big, powerful, stable empire that lasted for about 400 years. Of course, it fell, and it fell violently and chaotically. And that's the period of time that I become quite interested in Chinese history. So we've got this period is the period of fallenness, of divide that I just mentioned, this period between empires where China is again united in 589 with the Sui And then, of course, we have the Tang, where Empress Wu is going to rule and take over. So I'm really interested in this period of time called the Southern and Northern Dynasties. That's the period of time we have a lot of source materials for, both textual, art historical, material cultural, and it's a time when people are experimenting with different ways of doing social organization and experimenting with different ways of gender organization. And also, and importantly for me and for this talk, this is the time in which polities are making Buddhism the state religion. So Buddhism comes into China during the Han Dynasty in various ways and sort of becomes common and domesticates, but it's really in this Southern and Northern dynasty split where it's made the official court religion of dynasties both north and south. All right, so let's keep going on this kind of, we're going to narrow in from the big picture to a smaller picture to eventually a very, very small picture. So just stick with me through this historical context. So the Northern Southern dynasties is called that because there's this divide between North and South. It's not a stable divide. This is what it looks like in the year 440 when these two empires, the Northern Wei and the Liaosong, are ruling different parts of what we now call China, North and South. But it doesn't always look that way. There's constantly changing polities and empires, sometimes mind-boggling how quickly the overturn is of these polities. But these are two very dominant ones in the period. We're going to talk about the Northern Wei in this talk because the Northern Wei is probably the most successful example of an empire that came from Inner Asia. So we're talking about the Inner Asian steppe here. Peoples from these regions migrated south into what we call the Central Plains of China and set up their own empires during this period. Whereas the Southern empires are more associated with the peoples and cultural traditions of the old Han Empire that had fallen. So we had this kind of meeting of two different peoples in the same geographic space in this period. I'm particularly interested in the Northern Wei because even though there were other Northern dynasties that were absolutely fascinating, because of the time period and the success, I guess, of the Northern Wei's experiments with governance, we have a lot of source materials that document what was happening in that empire. So it's a good example of a number of different kinds of polities that were arising in the area of the world that we now call China in this time period. And what we can, this other map here is just kind of a zoom in so we can position say the founding peoples who founded this region. So we have the Gulf here. We can look over and find the Gulf here. This is the same Gulf. The peoples who founded the Northern Wei trace their lineage way up here to a place called the Gaxian Cave, which is now in modern-day Inner Mongolia. If you visit the Gaxian Cave, you'll see a few things. You'll see the remnants of some ancient ritual platforms in the cave that suggest this was a place of importance. And you'll also see an inscription written in Chinese, because the Tagbach didn't write down their own language. It was an oral language. So the inscription is in Chinese, basically saying that this is the birthplace of the Tagbach people who founded the Northern Wei. And this, it was made there as a kind of attempt for the Northern Wei rulers to invent themselves ethnically in China as a polity of power and history. Eventually, these peoples moved south, established one of their capitals here in Pingcheng, which is modern-day Datong, very successful, and even more successful in the 490s. They moved their capital to Luoyang. Why is that successful? Because Luoyang is one of the capitals of the old Han Empire. So this move south is geographical, but it's also cultural, and it's also powerful. They're taking over really the heartlands of Chinese civilization as they move their capital to Luoyang. And it's in this Luoyang period we're going to talk about. So all of this has been to kind of center the groups of people that we're talking about here and to let us get a grip on the kinds of ethnic and cultural diversity that really typifies this period. The other things on this map are places that are of importance to Northern Wei and to my telling of Northern Wei history. This place over here I'm going to mention later. This is the birthplace of Empress Dowager Ling that we're going to talk about. Other places are fairly familiar in terms of Buddhist history. All right, so we're going to move forward. How do we know that any of this is true? We can read texts. There are textual sources that describe the progression of these peoples from the north to the south. These are historiographical in the sense that they are telling a particular kind of story, a story of a creation of a people and their movement south. But recently, recent finds in archaeology have started to find new things along that route down from the Gaxian Cave into the central plains of China. This is just an example of some of the things that archaeology is turning up right now. I find this one really compelling because this is a ritual platform that was likely used by the Northern Wei court before moving to Luoyang, so earlier on in the dynasty. Why we can think that it was likely used by that court is because we have textual descriptions of a ritual that fits the design of this particular altar. So we have a really nice example here of textual sources overlapping with archaeological sources to confirm what we think we know about history. And that's sort of the place that I like to play in my research methodology. I like to think about the different kinds of sources that are available and how we can verify those source materials and other kinds of source materials, or how we're forced to tell different kinds of stories than the ones that we're normally given if our different forms of source materials don't kind of match up and don't like verify what normative history has told us. So I just show this as an illustration of some of the things that inspire me as a scholar and thinking about the ways in which different sorts of source materials can work together. All right. So this is confusing, and I show it to you with apology, but it is in the book. So if you've read the book, you've seen this diagram. What we're looking at here, and so we went from that big picture, what is Northern Southern Dynasty, so what is Northern Wei, and now we're talking about Luoyang Northern Wei. We're talking about a particular woman named Empress Dowager Ling, who the book is nominally about, although the book is about many different women. I show you this for a few reasons. Because I'm going to talk eventually about a succession crisis that helps us understand how political power was invested in women in the period and how Empress Wu also played on that sort of role of political power. But we're going to look here at Empress Dowager Ling for a second and position ourselves in this very complex court. And I'm going to point out some actors whose names I'll say. So Empress Dowager Ling's son is an emperor, Emperor Xiaoming. She's not the official empress. She actually, records tell us, has the official empress murdered. But she becomes Empress Dowager after the death of Emperor Xuanwu, who is the father of her son. So she's in a conjugal relationship. She's a concubine to him. They have this son. At the point of the birth of Xiaoming, this line of emperors, Northern Wei emperors, this is what we're looking at right here. This has become a direct system of father to son ascension to the throne. Prior to that, in the Northern Wei, there was a different way of picking the emperor. But with Wencheng, we have father, son, father, son, father, son, father, son. And then we get here, a situation that I'm going to talk about for the next 10 minutes or so. We have a child put in the throne after the death of Xiaoming. The child is a girl. This is the intriguing historical thing about this whole situation. The child is a girl, the granddaughter of Empress Dowager Ling, the daughter of Empress Xiaoming. So she takes the position in the lineage. That doesn't sit well with everybody else. This is one event that kind of brings about the fall of the dynasty, or at least rhetorically brings about the fall of the dynasty. And you can see the line of descent is then cut off. So we don't anymore have a parent-child relationship. We have reached out to different cousins of the imperial line here. And the rest of these emperors are emperors who are propped up by these guys, who are major power players, who wanted to challenge the court. This one also murdered our Empress Dowager. So these guys kind of try to control the empire for about 6 years, and then it ultimately collapses. The person who's really successful is this guy called Gao Huan, who is the patriarch of the Gao family. His son becomes emperor of Northern Qi, which is the successor dynasty to Northern Wei. So why am I telling you all this? It's important to think about our sources in this context. When they established the Northern Qi, they commissioned the writing of the history of the Northern Wei. So if you know about the progression of Chinese dynasties, there's often, always, historical text that's written about the dynasty after its collapse. Normally, a period of time passes. Normally, that text is written by committee. In this case, there's not very much time passes at all because they ask this guy, Wei Shou, to write the official history of the Northern Wei. Now, Wei Shou is somebody who is part of the court before its collapse. He lives through violent chaos. He somehow escapes death and surfaces again powerfully here. So he's got all sorts of vested interests in his writing of the official history of this dynasty, and probably in a very difficult and tumultuous relationship with this emperor who wants his dynasty to be clearly positioned as the successor. And so I point this all out because much of what we know of Northern Wei history comes from this text, but this text is itself problematic. And I just want to put that out there because that's kind of the basis of how I'm dealing with a lot of my sources, is thinking about which parts of this text we can question, which parts of this text are likely true, and how do we use other sources of information to verify that. Okay, so what we have is this baby girl that we know really nothing about. Wei Shou's text tells us this. This is all it tells us. That the Empress Dowager took the baby, put her on the throne as a prince, saying, you know, put her there as the emperor. Then eventually she says it's a girl, and this doesn't go well. The girl's taken off the throne, and another boy is put on the throne. A boy who's a more distant heir, a kind of cousin. And we know nothing else. We don't know what happens to the baby girl after this. I assume nothing good happens to the baby girl after this. And it's kind of taken as an example of how reckless Empress Dowager Ling was in her last days of her rule. That's really all that is said about this. And for me as a researcher, that's never been satisfying, because how can you make such a mistake putting up an emperor? You know, this is a very scrutinized political decision, and I've just never sort of been happy with the idea that it was just sort of casual and then it was forgotten, and that's all we know. So I've always wanted to kind of figure out more about this story, and that's what chapter 4 of my book does. And I'm going to walk you through some of the arguments in chapter 4, because I think when we understand why Empress Dowager Ling took the risk of putting a baby girl on the throne, we can also maybe understand some of the cultural work that went into supporting Empress Wu when she became Emperor Wu Zhao in the Tang Dynasty. So I'm going to jump into this story a little bit further. All right, so and I'm going to start by talking a little bit about why we should do this work and how we should do it. I'm just going to put a lot of information on the slide here. So why do we do this? Because it hasn't really been done in a fulsome way, in a certain sense. There hasn't been enough questioning of the normative political history of this dynasty or this period in general, because we have these texts, and these texts look very complete, even though they clearly have their own historiographical biases. Those biases, I would say, are that the texts, these dynastic histories, are both androcentric and ethnocentric. So what does it mean? It means they express the lives of men much more than the lives of women. They give us much more detail about men. They center men in the texts, which is something we should expect from this particular court situation. They're also ethnocentric in the sense that it's mostly Han men whose stories are told in these texts. Where we have a dynasty like the Northern Wei, we get the stories of non-Han people, but from the perspective of this same style of writing, the Northern Wei is sort of considered an illegitimate dynasty because it's ruled by non-Han peoples. So in the case of our Empress Dowager, we have a kind of double bias. Not only is she a woman, but she's a woman who rules a dynasty that's considered illegitimate. All right, so how are we going to get there? What are we going to do? We're going to look as widely through different kinds of materials as we can, and I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A and some of the other materials I've used in the book in Q&A. And I adopt this method of feminist historiography as a way of describing how I want to take seriously the work of uncovering bias in this text. I think it's feminist in the sense that a fair representation is, to me, a feminist project. I think it's a historiography because what we're doing is looking at historical facts, but trying to tell a different story, stacking up the data in a different way that brings different kinds of things to light. So in this case, in the case of my work, we're talking about women, we're talking about ethnic others, we're also talking about religious practices and as they relate to politics. So that's kind of a little brief introduction to my methodology, which of course I'm happy to talk about further. But let's jump into the early 6th century and look at some things that were happening. So this is a portrait from a cave in Longmen. This is not a donor portrait. This is a portrait of the recipients of the merit for the building of this particular cave. The cave was patronized by the Empress Dowager's uncle, and arguably this figure here has been identified as Empress Dowager Ling. And I think it's the one of maybe two solidly identifiable portraits of her. So this would have been a portrait commissioned in her time that she would have seen. So we can trust that she may have appreciated what she looked like or how she's presented. So who else is here? We have Xiaoming, likely, and we can identify him as male because of the different hats that he's wearing. Again, this is not my work. I don't do the work of identifying these kinds of figures, but I draw heavily on the work of our historians, so I'm greatly appreciative of. What we also have, and what I think is fabulously interesting, is this depiction of nuns. I talk a lot about nuns throughout the book, but particularly in chapter 3, and I'm happy to talk about those in Q&A. Why I think that these are nuns and not monks, there's a few reasons. There's a gendered representation here. This is the female procession. There's a male procession in another part of the cave. The only, except for Xiaoming being male in this line, but that tells us a lot about who's actually holding power in the dynasty, and that's his mother, Empress Dowager Ling. We also know from other sources that there were sort of 3 major nuns in the Northern Wei. This one, I think, is supposed to represent her aunt, this is a nun, I think, called Zhou, who brought Empress Dowager to court herself. And these 2 women doing the kind of ritual work here, I think, are women who held this monastic title of kind of like the supreme female monastic of like the administrative part of Buddhist bureaucracy. So I think we have a quite interesting image that we can verify from other sources. The last thing I would like to point out, and this is just me sleuthing about, and if anyone has any better answers, I would love to hear them. She wears this strange hat. I say it's strange because it doesn't look like other hats. It's sort of remarkable, and it's caused me to pause a lot. And I think we have a comparable sort of situation in the later Mongol empires with the Mongol women who wore this gugu hat or bokta. I'm not saying they're the same hat. I'm saying I think what's happening is the work of signaling ethnic difference through dress. So we have a different kind of a hat when we have ethnically different persons ruling. And we see this in different kinds of robes and jewelry as well. But I think that that's what's happening here with the hat. So here we have the ideas of women holding political power, women working alongside Buddhist monastics, and women signaling ethnic difference in their holding of political power. Okay. So let's go back to her. What did she do? Why is she so interesting? She, even though she's Empress Dowager, she rules directly. She uses the like the Chinese royal we in self-reference. So she basically calls herself Your Majesty. She is said to hear the petitions of everybody in her polity directly. So she doesn't, she rides her own like horse cart around the empire, collecting petitions, hearing people's problems and making policy decisions. She doesn't sit behind a screen at court, whereas that would be expected in some cases of women who are at court. So she's wielding power absolutely directly in her own name at this point in time. And I think she's very comparable to a different emperor who we know a lot about. So if you know your Northern and Southern dynasties history, you've heard of this emperor, Emperor Wu Zetian, very famous emperor of the Southern polity that's going alongside our Northern Wei at this time. So these 2 rulers are ruling at the same time. Many historical sources tell us all about Liang Emperor Wu, and they tell us about his Buddhist patronage. They tell us that he made these big Buddhist rituals at court. They tell us that he built Buddhist structures. He's called the Bodhisattva Emperor in many different sources. So we have a lot of information about him. What has always been a little bit unsatisfying to me is that Empress Dowager Ling is doing the very same things that he is doing in this Northern dynasty. But they haven't been well expressed. We have to look in a lot of different places to uncover what it is that she's doing. So we can't read a nice kind of biography of her as a Bodhisattva emperor, let's say. So what is she doing? She's also building big Buddhist structures. She patronizes the building of what would then have been the tallest known building in the world, for the world of Asia in this period. It was a Buddhist pagoda at a temple that was built just outside of the palace in Luoyang. She was a major patron of the Buddhist caves at Longmen, which you can still see today. She patronized the translation of Buddhist textual materials. She patronized large-scale religious assemblies at her court, and she oversaw a monastic organization of monks and nuns, but particularly I talk about nuns in my book. So she was deeply involved with ruling her empire through Buddhist means, but she's somebody that history hasn't really told us about. And in my book, I think I put up a map here. So you can just see that the Liang, this is right after her death when the Northern Wei splits into Western and Eastern, but you can just see the divide here. So Liang Emperor Wu is ruling here. He's famous for his Buddhist patronage. Empress Dowager Ling is moving up here, doing the same thing, but we don't know anything about her. So I argue that both of these rulers were comparable rulers. They were ruling directly and they were ruling through Buddhism. Buddhism was the state religion of their court in this time period. So putting her on the map just lets us know that other people are doing these things and women are doing these things. All right, so to talk a little bit more about why they're using Buddhism at court, we're going to venture into thinking about how Buddhist kingship developed in early medieval China. How did rulers identify themselves as kings or sorry, as Buddhas? And the earliest example, the earliest best example of this comes also from the Northern Wei, but from the time when the capital was in modern-day Datong. This is the famous Buddhist cave site of Yungang. This is not the original, this is just a picture I like, so this is not showing all the original first 5 Buddhas there. But what we're told in historical sources is that the original 5 caves that were built in this site were the kind of the mastermind of the monastic overseer of this time. So this head chief monastic member, a Buddhist monk, commissioned or designed the kind of structure of these early caves with the express purpose of building a lineage of Northern Wei emperors into the faces of Buddhas. So remember I said that Empress Wu maybe also did that at Longmen, putting her own face into a monumental Buddha. Well, that has an old Northern Wei history. And so we have these first 5 Buddhas meant to be the 5 rulers of the Northern Wei as they were seen at that time. At least that's what sources tell us. So there's a long history of Buddhas and rulers side by side. It's worth mentioning also that a very famous Buddhist text called the Scripture on Humane Kings, if you're familiar with it, also appears to have arisen historically out of this period. That text tells us that the Buddha and the ruler are basically 2 sides of the same coin. Whereas the Buddha has ultimate power in the kind of realms we cannot see, the king has ultimate power in this formed world that we live in, and that they're basically 2 characters that are the same. So we start to get this popular understanding in the 5th century about how Buddhas and rulers are basically the same kind of thing and their identities mesh together. What I think is really fascinating is that this is an idea that is also open to women in a certain way. So we're going to look at that. So we're going to go back to our image here. So this is a small image. Above this image, there's a niche. So I'm going to show you what's in the niche. Just go up. So we were here. Here's our Empress Dowager, right? Here's the nuns. And then we have this niche on top of her. Who's in the niche but Shakyamuni Buddha and Prabhudaratna Buddha? These are 2 Buddhas from a particular story in the Lotus Sutra where these 2 Buddhas meet side by side in the cave. What's interesting about this image of 2 Buddhas side by side is that it becomes more popular in this period that we're talking about, in this Northern Wei period that we're talking about, where we have co-rulership with women. And it also becomes popular again in Dunhuang during the co-reign of Wu Zetian and Gaozong. So we have these kind of reduplicating motifs of these 2 Buddhas side by side that in the Tang dynasty are more explicitly associated, or we can argue at least that they are associated with this idea of the 2 sage reign of Wu Zetian and Gaozong. So what I want to point out here is we don't have the kind of depth of sources from the Northern Wei that we have of the Tang, but we can make conjectures. So we see here these 2 Buddhas, this kind of early incidents of these 2 Buddhas side by side in a cave where we have, in fact, the 2 rulers side by side here. We can also see, if we look in different sources, in the Northern Wei, this word two sages being used to describe regency rule for different women in the Northern Wei, as it was used by Empress Wu in the Tang. So this is not Empress Dowager Ling, this is a woman who came before her and ruled up in Pingchang or Datong. And this is the emperor she ruled with, not her son. That's a whole different story. But they are called the two sages in this stele inscription. And then later on in the Luoyang era, we have this inscription where again we see the word two sages being applied here to Empress Dowager Ling and Empress Xiaoming. And this is commissioned by the half brother of the father of Xiaoming. So this is somebody deeply involved in the court who is referring to these two rulers as the two sages. So we have all these different pieces in play in this period that allow us to think about how women represented themselves in Buddhas just as men did. Okay, so what else do we have going on? We know that that's happening, this identification of the Buddha and the ruler, but we can get a little bit more narrow. In this 6th century context and late 5th century context, we also see a rise, a marked rise in the idea of Maitreya as the ideal ruler for a number of reasons. Maitreya, as you all know, is the next Buddha to come along. In many texts, he's a sort of millenarian figure and he ushers in a new time of great peace. This was taken seriously by a number of different peoples in medieval China who either tried to control their court by recourse to Maitreyan imagery and identifying themselves as Maitreya, or challenge the court by saying, no, a new Maitreya has been born in this millenarian figure and we're going to raise rebellion against the court. In the context of the Northern Wei, in that change between the 5th and 6th centuries, there were about 10 serious rebellions against the Northern Wei court, many of them directed and led by people who were identified as the birth of Maitreya. So there's this kind of constant idea that Maitreya is potentially coming at any time and will have this political role at court. The last of those rebellions was quashed just the year after the Empress Dowager takes power. So this is a very active thing in our time period. And we also see in the same time period the court itself experimenting with how to bring Maitreya into a kind of more pointed understanding of rulership. So this is, again, not my identification as not an art historian, but a few art historians of the period have pointed out that Maitreyan imagery becomes very popular in imperial cave sites in this period. So we have, the kind of 5 past Buddhas before that line kind of continues on in building these imperial cave sites. And then in the Luoyang period, we start to have Maitreya added on here. And Maitreya is probably signifying the birth of the heir apparent. In this case, it would be Shuangwu and then Xiaoming. So we have this kind of idea that the line of the Tuoba or the Tagbach people is going to continue on just like the line of the Buddhas does in this kind of rise of Maitreyan imagery. I pointed out in a map a few slides ago, well, many slides ago at this point, this area called Anding, where the Empress Dowager is from. She also is recorded to have patronized the building of a cave site in Anding, in her birthplace, in the time in which she's either pregnant with Xiaoming or he's just born. It's hard to tell. And again, Maitreya is the sort of central figure at that cave site. So we have this clear identification between the court putting up its next rulers as the Bodhisattva Maitreya. And of course, that's what Empress Wu does with the Great Cloud Sutra. She's seen as a fulfillment of the Maitreyan prophecy. And we have that prophecy in play in the Northern Wei as well. So that prophecy comes to us from a text called the Great Cloud Sutra, which has long been associated with the Tang, even though that we know the translations are earlier. Here we have a record, a colophon to the copying of sutras from this person called Yuan Rong, Yuan being the name of the imperial family. So he's a Tagbach imperial family member. This one is commissioned slightly after the Northern Wei, but he was put himself there during the Northern Wei as the regional inspector of Guazhou, which is where Dunhuang is. So these are Dunhuang texts, and he also commissioned this cave in Dunhuang, one of the earliest caves there. So this is a foundational Buddhist figure in East Asia in some ways. And what he kind of does is every time there's political chaos, every time there's a new ruler put up at the end of the Northern Wei and through into the Northern Qi, he seems to commission texts. So he does this big text copying thing. And we can see a kind of interesting library of texts that he commissions at this time, this kind of major funder of Buddhism in the period. And we see reference, I think this is the earliest written dated reference to the Great Cloud Sutra by this Northern Wei courtier. So we know that the ideas of the Great Cloud Sutra are there. We know that people have read this text apparently, and we know it's popular because it's also being commissioned alongside really popular Buddhist texts of the period, like the Lotus Sutra and the Sutra on the Wise and the Fool. So this isn't just kind of a casual reference. These are popular texts of the period. So we have all those pieces in play. But how does that explain what his daughter is? And this helps us to get to Empress Wu a little bit further. And I'll try to work through this a little bit faster because I think I've been taking too much time. So Empress Yaoming is Maitreya in a way that's set up by the court and patronized by the court. And we all know we have got the Great Cloud Sutra, we've got Maitreyan imagery around. What is his daughter, this child that's put on the throne? How do we understand her in a way that also helps us to understand Empress Wu a little bit better? So to go here, we need to think about gender to try to answer this question. And when we think about gender, I want us to appreciate the fact that gender doesn't always operate in the same way that we think it operates, that we assume to be natural in the world today. In particular, and I take inspiration by this scholar, Sylvia Tomoshkova, she asks us to attempt to imagine the unimaginable with respect to gender, rather than only mirror the most recent arrangements and see only that which we deem comprehensible. So what she's asking us to do here in her study of shamans and the gender of shamans is to think about the fact that not everyone does gender in binary ways. Not everyone does gender in ways that are tied to sexual identification. There are different ways of thinking about how gender operates in society. And I think if we can attempt to take that seriously, we can have a different way of thinking about this girl in the throne that makes a little bit more sense. So I'll tell you where I've gone with this thinking. I'm happy to talk about this further. I think that during the Northern Wei, there was a group of women who were known as honorary men. Maybe this isn't the best word. I'm happy to talk about different words for what it is that I'm describing here, but this is how I talk about them in the book. What does that mean? That means that in certain social situations, a woman would act as a man in society. What would that look like? It would be normally a situation where a woman does not have a father or a brother. There are no elder men in her family to fulfill male roles. And so she takes on that male role herself. The most obvious referent to this, and one you certainly know, is Mulan. So, Disney has told us many versions of the Mulan story. There are so many retellings of the Mulan story. The earliest legend of Mulan identifies Mulan as a Northern Wei woman, a Tagbach woman. Potentially that early myth has some bits of the Tagbach language in it. And so we know that this is a story. This is probably an oral tradition of a woman who fights in the military on behalf of her family because her father is unable, and she's, through her sort of act of gender transgression, she is able to uphold family honor. At least that's how it's told in the kind of Chinese retellings of it. So that's a good reference point for what it is that I'm talking about. But we're going to say goodbye to Mulan because the problem is we don't have any way to verify this Mulan story in any dated documents or any dated historical sources. What we do have, though, and these long intrigued me, are names like this. So we get women on inscriptions holding names that in some way bring them closer to manhood, or some way like link them to maleness or manhood in society. And these always perplexed me. They still perplex me, but I think I've gotten a bit further into understanding them. And you can read these names as a sort of through a kind of Confucian frame, a sort of asking for male progeny, that kind of thing. And maybe that's also at play in some of these names too. But I think we can understand them through a different lens, and we can think about gender among the Tagbach people more seriously. So what we have here are two tomb inscriptions. So these are, carved in stone in the tomb of the dead person. Both of these women, they both held this title, the female secretary. So you can see here, these are both female secretaries. These are both female secretaries who worked for Empress Dowager Ling. and who also worked for her predecessor. So these are like high members of this court that's staffed with women during the Northern Wei. So both of them are the same title. Both of them also have kind of given names, not birth names, given names that identify them with manhood. So one is sort of like welcoming a man, one is sort of like monastic man. But we have this kind of play on maleness in the names of these women, which is unique. I have to point out, this is not a common name for a woman. It's not just a random transliteration or something like that. These are unique. When we read these biographies, what we learn in both cases is that neither of these women had a father, neither of these women had a brother. Both of these women rose through the court because of their intelligence and ability to read and write, and were given bureaucratic roles in the Northern Wei court. Because of their own striving, is what we're told here. They are described often through sort of male characteristics, like the ability to be dispassionate and learned. I mean, I'm saying that these are often sort of male characteristics in the time period. Neither woman marries, neither woman has children. So these are women who sort of choose their path in what looks like a kind of gender ambiguous or even male way as independent politicians of the Northern Wei court. And both of them bear this title. Neither of them have fathers or brothers. So I think if we see these names, and these are the only two examples we have of this. So we can't say we have other female secretaries holding different kinds of names and identities. We only have these two. So maybe we'll get more later, but these are the only ones we know of, and they bear such striking similarity that we have to take it seriously. So I think that's what's going on. So where does that take us? We can think about the line of succession where our baby girl is put on the throne. We can think about her just in that line of succession. You know, she follows along in the line of succession. She's a child. We can think about her as Maitreya in the same way that Empress Wu was, because there's this prophecy of a birth of a female Maitreya. But I think we can also think of her as fulfilling what, for the Tabgach, I believe was a cultural institution already. This idea of having honorary maleship in a situation where you need a male member of the family to fulfill a role, but there's no men available. So I think that all of those things kind of come together. And it is true that even though Empress Wu was the only person who ruled China as a female in her own right, this baby that was just there that we know nothing about actually was the first woman to hold that title of emperor for the very short time that she did. So all of this kind of moves us toward thinking about how Empress Wu was able to kind of work with her predecessors and the models that were established there in order to signal her own power. And she certainly knew about the Northern Wei, Empress Wu and Emperor Wu Zhao in that title. There were a lot of kind of Buddhist writings about Northern Wei from the perspective of the Tang. So it's not like this stuff was foreign to her. She knew about it. All right, so my last slide, I'm just going to wrap up here and talk out. So we kind of talked in, now we're going to talk out a little bit and think about what this kind of history, what this kind of work lets us know about China in general. And there's sort of four things that I'm going to pop into. The first one is this idea of sinification. So you probably all know this kind of model of sociological expression or cultural expression in imperial China, which says that peoples moved from Inner Asia into the central plains of China, and when they did so, they took on Chinese culture and civilization. So they took on Chinese language, they took on Chinese court systems, that kind of thing. I think here what we see in doing this kind of research that tries to dive in to the cultural norms of others in the period lets us flip the switch really easily on the sinification kind of monologue and say, well, here's an example of something completely different. Here's an example of peoples from Inner Asia bringing in their own ideas of gender, their own ideas of which kinds of people can hold power and why. And then that idea continuing on through the reign of the Tang Dynasty and Empress Wu. Something I'm on about lately, if you've heard me talk on about various things, is the idea of periodization. I think a study like this lets us change how we periodize Chinese history. So I've mentioned before that this period is like a dark ages, it's divided and it's chaotic. That's how it's often described in periodization. Some scholars have pointed out that even with that violence, there was a lot of creativity in things like military advancements and religious technology. what I want to point out is that this period is actually a high point for the diversification of social roles for women. So if we look at this through the scope of feminist historiography, what we actually see is this is not a dark ages at all. This is a golden period for women's roles, and also for the roles of ethnic others in China at this time. So we can rethink how history has been periodized and why it has been periodized that way, and in what kinds of sources it has been periodized that way, and how we can kind of pick that apart. A lesson in history versus historiography. I'm always kind of playing in that kind of nexus. So I'm interested in telling stories about history from using facts. So that's a historiographical project, and it allows us to look at old sources and think, is this true or is this a story, right? And if it's a story, how do we tell other kinds of stories around it? Or how do we take the bits that we can think are probably true, dated bits of history, and tell different kinds of stories that bring to light different kinds of people? And the last thing I'll say before I formally stop talking, because this is a Buddhist Studies talk, I think, and I want to be more forceful about this in the future and with the students I work with, Buddhist Studies has so much to say about women's history. And this is true of the medieval period. This is true of the modern period. Why I think this is true, and I'm happy to hear other people's perspectives on this, is that women have been interested in doing Buddhism since the beginning, right? Women have built Buddhist tradition across the world. That's true of much of modern Buddhism. That's true of medieval Buddhism. Some of these earliest figures in Buddhist history that really put a lot of money and support into building Buddhism in East Asia were women. And if we look back in history, we see that. What that means is that when we look at Buddhist sources, we see women's history in a way that we don't see it when we look at court-produced sources or sources that are considered sort of high literature. We don't see women in those sources, but we see women when we zero in on Buddhist sources. So I sort of leave you with that as kind of one of the cornerstones of my own commitments as a scholar in methodologies, or to think about the ways in which we can really like hone in on that observation and do a kind of different sort of history that takes seriously the lives of women as they're shown in Buddhist sources. All right, so with that, I will stop the formal part of my talk, and I'm really happy to hear any questions and I will answer them to the best of my abilities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephanie.